Today I'm just in the studio. I'm going to be going through a little bit about how I'm 3D printing with clay. Whoa, shit! So the last few videos I've been showing the making of a large-scale sculpture that I'm working on. It'll be my first UK permanent public sculpture. And the previous mould was from the head down to the waist of the sculpture, of the figure sitting. And today I'm going to be printing from the neck upwards. I generally cast these in two parts, and this is, I love the kind of moment where the head actually it starts to almost disappear into nothing. You'll see a little bit more about what I mean by that later. But the sculpture that I'm printing, so this is a small maquette. This is about, I think, 22 centimeters long. This here is cast into white bronze. The actual sculpture will be cast into aluminium, and this will be about 2.5 meters long. And so, as I say, from the waist, which is here, if you can see that, so the waist, which is, I think it's locking on my face, so the waist from here, I printed up to the neck, and then you've just got the head here, so you've got the figure sitting in the boat, and the cargo's at the front. But with the head, I'll be casting it in my sort of traditional casting way, which is I print the moulds, I let them dry, and I'll be casting them with wax. But today I'm going to be focusing a little bit on how I actually print with porcelain. You've got several problems. Obviously you've got the kind of moisture, humidity levels in the studio and in the clay, so you need to monitor those. I'll be showing a little bit on that. Extrusion using an air compressor and an aluminium tank, and then a steel extruder unit that I built myself. But yeah, the clay's all wedged and it'll be loaded into the machine, and you'll see me firing it up this evening. So at the moment I'm just connecting the printer both to the laptop and to the power sockets down here. You hear that, like boom boom. I'll be getting the print platform loaded onto the bed and pressurizing the air compressor. So you'll hear the compressor go in a moment. I need to raise the sails. Just move the extruder unit to the center of the bed. And what I do, generally if I know I'm printing within a week or something, I'll tape the machine up. That's what I've done here and here, it's electrical tape, just to stop any of this kind of drying in the line. And it still feels pretty squidge. Yeah, I remember this clay being quite wet, so I'm a bit nervous that kind of the extrusion is going to be so thick when it pops out. But and at this point, I just need to play with the pressure on the air compressor and just get it to come out at the correct sort of thickness for what I want. So yeah, we're literally starting this mould at neck height, and so it's quite important for me to just kind of stress this muscular kind of form in the neck area. I really always love my figures having these kind of muscular emphasis around the neck and the jaw. I've read so much actually about this idea of the jaw, the neck, being this kind of bridge between the brain and the body. And I love that when it's cast against this idea of men taking it on the chin and having to kind of suppress these sort of emotions. It makes a lot of sense. And again, the neck actually acts, as I say, as a sort of barrier between the brain and the body. And if you've got these impulses coming up from the body that you need, these physical forms of contact, but you're suppressing it, it obviously all goes into the kind of neck and jaw area of the individual. They play quite a big kind of part in my work. I think that the neck of the figure. And so this is the layer where I really need to start emphasising this muscular pattern, because this is the one that's on the inside of the mould that you can see here. So this is what the wax is going to be casting up against. And again, as I sort of ripple this back and forth, you kind of start to feel like these muscle fibres emerging from the flesh. We're more around the kind of jaw side of the figure here, so the ripples are getting more frequent, which suggests those more tightly kind of knitted muscles. But no, this was actually this idea of the neck and the kind of its involvement with the individual in intimacy and identity. A book by Alexander Lowen. It's called like The True Self or something like that. But it's looking a lot at this separation of the mind and the body through various suppression of different energies, and Freud obviously captured it as this sort of sexual energy. The author of this book, Alexander Lowen, he studied under, I believe, Jung, and but it was this sort of bioelectrical energy. It wasn't just this kind of sexual impulse anymore. And so it did start to examine the body in this sort, rather than it being this spunking, kind of spitting, shitting machine. It was this sort of electrical network of switches and fibres and networks, and how that comes into play with various states of kind of being. And I read this when I was like, I was like 16, 17. You should have needed a license to buy like certain self-help books at that age, I think. I certainly think that needs to be far more regulated than it is. But I read it, and it had quite a profound effect on how I saw myself, people around me, my relationships, my goals. And then shortly after that, I came across the work of various outsider artists, Gustav Mesmer, Adolf Wolfli, various others, and I just started to kind of get obsessed with this notion of the machine, particularly these kind of. So again, we're back into the flesh. So as we're getting particularly obsessed with these relationships between the body and the machine, often in these kind of outsider artworks, you would find ideas of control, like paranoid sort of conspiracies. James Tilly Matthews with the heirloom machine, for example, like an absolutely fascinating example of the relationship between the body and machine. And I believe the first documented case of schizophrenia in the UK. I've just finished printing the first tank of porcelain. I'm just going to get that swapped over now. So that's the pressure escaping from the tank. I have so many nightmares about kind of letting it slip my thoughts and opening this up before I take that off, and just having some porcelain kind of explosions happening. So far, pretty good. So this tank here is aluminium. I've noticed over time, obviously when the porcelain arrives at the studio, it's got that kind of typical, just slightly off-white and white colouring that porcelain has. But then I've noticed over time, as it's been going through and through the machine on cycle, it's started developing a sort of grey colouring, which actually the print that I've been doing you can kind of see it now. It's more exaggerated when it's wet, and like porcelain, as it dries, it gets lighter. But what I have noticed that I find absolutely fascinating is inside of each noodle. So once it dries, it still actually returns to that kind of typical porcelain white colouring. But what I have noticed, when you break the kind of the noodles off, inside of each noodle is a more concentrated grey noodle, and depending on how dry it is, depends on how kind of, I guess, concentrated that is in the centre. And it's fascinating to think actually that each sculpture with these kind of hundreds of noodles. Inside of those there's like an even finer concentrate of aluminium finding its way and still trying to kind of make a sensible pathway throughout the sculpture. And I don't really know what force that is. I don't know if the aluminium sort of migrating to the center. I'm not sure, but I just love actually how some materials kind of react. Like you just, or at least I just suspected that the clay would kind of maintain a kind of constant grey throughout the mix. It's obviously quite evenly distributed after, as I say, being wedged so many times. But no, somehow it's still, the aluminium ions, whatever in it, they all sort of still find each other. I find it fascinating. And so at the moment, I'm just filling the tank back up. As you can see, the plunger has just made its way to the end of the tank. That's what that white kind of plastic is here. So I pop that out. I usually do it, yeah, you probably see it here, okay. Pop that out. And now the tank is empty. I'm just cleaning the tank. So that is pushed down like so. Just give it a little bit of a gap. And then this side is going to be filled with clay. And the clay, I do have some pre-wedged in the bags that I think I videoed the other day, but I'm actually just going to be salvaging and wedging this down, just because actually this and what's in this one as well might be enough to print this mould. And this is exactly what I mean by that movement of the aluminium in the clay. Look how clean that is. Be curious to see how it fired, if it ever did, but I never bother. But yeah, more of it just throughout the entire clay. I'm just going to be attempting to wedge down this clay. And this is the worst table to be doing it on. I probably won't be able to. And so yeah, I'm certainly not a ceramicist. When I wedge, I just kind of mean I'm softening it in some way. I'm not quite doing a full pugging, which is kind of getting all the air out, but it's not. I just knocked the air valve on my compressor. And yet, so I'm not doing a full pug, which is getting all the air out. Which it isn't so important for the way that I use it actually, because with the tolerances of the machine, I put a little kind of air escape hole into the extruder, which actually some commercial systems don't have. So it's far more important that you have a pug, a pugging machine. But in my system, I have that kind of exit hole, and you hear it occasionally while I'm printing. The print kind of pops, and occasionally some clay kind of fires out. I of course don't fire the work, so it's kind of just not so important to have, but it probably just as well, because as I say, I'm not a ceramicist. My language has always kind of been one of the machine and that relationship with the figure, rather than clay and clay's relationship to the figure. Like, I have since gone on to, I think metal is probably the worst surface to do this on. Aluminium, I think, slightly porous, isn't it? That's why it can be anodized. That's probably not helping in terms of how it sticks. It's supposed to be done on plaster. Yeah, my language certainly isn't with clay. As I say, it's with the kind of machine and the figure. But I've since obviously come to learn clay's kind of relationship to the flesh, but also it's kind of obviously, it's very kind of obvious relationship to the ground, soil, the rocks, the earth, and the kind of figures that start to form in nature because of those kind of things. Yeah, I can just kind of feel it's all kind of quite uniform now, and actually in a perfect position to be printed with. It's funny actually working with the extrusion process so much. Kind of it gets to a point where you kind of blur the lines on extrusion, and like you kind of start to feel like the hairs are extruding themselves out of your face or your head, and your digestive system's kind of extruding food through you, and it's kind of becomes this again, it's like a very bodily kind of process, despite obviously my studio being like kind of really filled with machines. So I'm just cleaning the head of the tank now to set the seal will form a decent kind of airtight seal. With clay, do you think everything's clean? Like, this looks so clean for the moment. Same with like your floor, I'll mop it and it looks so clean, and then the minute it dries, see this sort of chalky residue starting to appear. It's like over everything, like my floor, my hair, currently my face, my lungs. Yeah, that's ready to be bolted back together, put onto the machine. I'm expecting to get through about 2 or 3 of these tanks. Let's raise the flag. The machine's now kitted back up. You hear the air enter now. It's repressurizing. Again, I always get worried about a little boom boom. And printing. And so I'm just turning the heaters on. So the sound's probably getting a bit mental with the printer and the 2 heaters. But this clay, I mean that bit just that I put through wasn't too bad, but the clay underneath is certainly too wet to have too much weight going on top of it. So I'm just trying to dry that as quick as possible, just to make sure there's no sort of, well, I don't want too much compression along the kind of Z axis of the print. So this means my whole sculpture is just kind of, yeah, compressed along that axis. You can just see I've started to introduce just a little bit of character here. So I'm just going to be building on that in a moment. So I've just had to fill up the tank for the 3rd time. I'm pretty sure this will be the last. But you can see from where we're at in the previous kind of clip, obviously a little bit lower, a little bit more organised. But I've just been really spaghettifying this sort of head, which, as I was saying earlier when I was showing the kind of bronze maquettes and things, it's just quite important for me to get that right. I may do this a few different times just to kind of catch the right expression, but I want to see how this turns out. We're currently at layer, what does it say here, 480. Yeah, all the layers that I'm printing here, 555. I started at 375 though, remember, so I'm just printing that today. And I'm currently 480, so we're here. So I've got, what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers left to print. You just see I've really kind of pushed this piece, which I'm quite excited for. This feels like it's been pushed a little bit more than some of my more recent pieces. Whoa, shit. So that was a little water explosion. Just because this clay was hard, I'd put some water in the tank. I'd slightly expected for it to distribute into the clay a little bit better than that, but it's okay. But yeah, look at all that mess up here. This is just kind of almost slick porcelain. Just dripping all down here. I'm just finishing up the last 2 layers now. Bit messy compared to usual, but this looks fantastic. I am so happy with the level of sort of abstraction that I've managed to push here, I'm just going to be kind of hair drying the last few layers. So I don't want that downward kind of pressure to compress the mould too much. Again, it's got a kind of good sort of structure, but yeah, we're on 525, which means we've got 2 layers. It's 15mm layer height. We finish at 555, and they obviously get progressively smaller and quicker, so literally you're looking at it a few moments away from being finished. I've really slowed it down as well, so I've got a little bit more control in these final moments, just in case anything does happen. At the moment I'm kind of just trying to seal everything that I've been working on in there, but not seal it too tightly. I want that kind of gradual disappearance from the head, the scalp, into nothing, via this sort of corally textures that I'm introducing in these kind of final parts. It's been quite a messy print compared to usual, all this overspill at the top. Yeah, and that is the sort of printing of the head mould, hopefully the final version, but maybe the first iteration of the head. We'll have to see once it's cast and taken out of its mould. At the moment it's just a very gooey, delicate mess that needs to kind of dry and set a little bit. I'll be letting that dry overnight. It may not be dry enough tomorrow, but in a few days I'll begin to kind of basically just fill in the holes, the gaps, and begin to make it into a sort of watertight mould, at which point it will be ready for casting with wax, and then obviously that will be stuck onto the severed head of the larger mould, so that will be stuck onto there, and then that will be from the waist up of the sculpture actually done. So air compressor is obviously pressurised to about 8 bar when I'm printing, as you've just seen. I can't leave that. I can't be leaving that pressurised overnight. So I let all of the air out of the compressor. However, because my floor was covered in dust, I kind of it almost feels like an Indiana Jones kind of booby traps being set off, and it's like, quick Indy, the room's filling with dust or something, and you have to kind of escape. So for that, I've actually got a little smart plug on my dust extractor, which is over here in the corner next to the werewolf. And that filters the air. It does actually run in the morning, and so it runs between 6 and 7 and 9 and 10 at night, just to kind of get my air cleaned up. But when I leave, I basically switch off the air compressor, let all the air out, as you'll hear with a hiss in a moment, and then the dust extractor. So my leaving routine, the kind of Indiana Jones booby trap, is dust blocker on, click, and now you'll hear the air compressor, and you actually, so that's now kicking up all the dust off the floor, so I kind of always run for the door like this,